A lot of folks have been asking me about my approach to ornamentation when I play music of Johann Sebastian Bach, and which surprised me because I've actually never really considered myself any kind of expert on Baroque style or practice. I actually have always said in interviews and such that I'm a modern player that tries to visit that world every now and then. But I do have a basic approach, I think, that can be articulated, and it's pretty simple. I think of ornamenting material on repeats in Baroque dance movements as one of two ways. With trills, with some kind of trill, ornamenting on top of a note with a trill, or taking cues from the melodic content and adding something more melodic to it. So sort of what I would just call melodic ornamentation. And the most basic example I can give that I've prepared here is from the Allemande from the BWV 995 suite here. In the Allemande, I'll just play the first phrase here, unadorned, much the way that some players would play it if they were performing it the first time through the repeat. Now, on the second time through in performance, I'll come up with a way of ornamenting it that's purely trill-oriented. Rather than playing that full chord, we can do maybe something like on the downbeat of measure 1. So there I put another trill on beat 4 of measure 1. And then instead of the simple appoggiatura, I come and I arrive on it again to augment the original appoggiatura on the downbeat of measure 2. There, I'm adding an extra trill now on the downbeat of measure 4. That's nice. I like the little cross-string nature of that right now as I'm playing it. Then if I play that all the way through, so that's all well and good, but when I'm at a concert personally and I hear all these kind of trills flying around, my modern ears maybe find it a little excessive. So I try to temper that kind of ornamentation with something a little bit more melodic. Now, if we take that same first phrase of the 995 Allemande, and we do something a little bit more melodic with it, we can take the notes in there and just find ways to do it. And it involves a little bit of composition. And that's basically what, the Baroque musicians and performers were all improvisers. It was very natural for them to compose. It wasn't really this kind of specialized skill like we have in our contemporary times of, you're a composer and you're an improviser and you're a classical music performer. They're all kind of one and the same. So something more melodic would be... something like that. Now what I'm doing, where I'll point out the spots where I did that. Beat 4 of measure 1. So becomes, and all I'm doing is I'm taking the perfect fourth from the E to the B. I'm just filling in the notes in between. And I play with direction, with dynamic direction. So that's a nice way. It adds some expressiveness to the playing for my ear. And then going on. Again, this is a perfect fifth leap upwards. So filled in with 2 steps and a leap of a third. You can even go further and maybe something like that. That's not a bad way. And then I fill this in on beat 3 by filling out this F major, this implied F major, major 7, 6 chord. If I went even further, measure 4 downbeat, I could fill in that too, and then you get now this in beat 4 and measure 4. I'm really just taking and going. I'm just making a sextuplet out of that final beat. And again, just filling in notes that are really that belong to the same contour, the same melodic contour. So I'm not really adding, I'm not changing the shape of the line, I'm merely adding to it. Now, I sometimes goof around in front of my students when at Cleveland Institute of Music and the Curtis Institute of Music by over-ornamenting in this melodic fashion, because while it can sound cool at first, as you could hear in that last example, it's a little much. Now that final stage is to go through, because it is healthy to actually see how much you can kind of mess around with it. I like to explore as many options as possible. And then, like a composer, then pare down from there, move back from there, selectively choose things that sound good, and then pair them together or arrange them. Much the way an arranger would or a composer would. So I typically end up in concert with something like this. Right, so now all I did was I only used 2 that time. I could have used a couple more, but that time I only used 2 of the 8 or 9 different examples, both trill and melodic, that I came up with. But I think over the course of a whole piece, being more selective about that and more tasteful with it is, in the long run, is a bit better. And it puts less of the emphasis on the performer and more of it on the music, on the architecture of the music. Plus, if you're not always filling in melodically, or I should say, if you are always filling in melodically, especially in a more French-style allemande like this, which has more space in it, more time space in, with longer rhythmic values, you end up choking all of that space and filling up all of that space all the time too. So that's also not such a good thing too. In my opinion, that's part of the composition, is the actual space. So that's just an example of a general approach that I have towards ornamentation. And while I'm on that, I mean, there's also the subject of cross-string trills. I can give you an example in the Sarabande of the first lute suite. For the repeat, you'll hear the augmentation that I do for this, ornamentation-wise. That's a melodic ornamentation. That was the second time around, is the trill, the original trill I did the first time. While keeping time. So even while you're doing these longer trills, you still want to be sure that you really keep time in the internal pulse. And then if I've got any time left the second time around, can add a little bit of a melodic ornamentation as a function of being pickups to the following phrase grouping. So I'm using that as an example to give you a little bit of how I approach the cross-string trill. So I guess we'll use that one there. Now the cell of that is essentially A, I, M, P on two adjacent strings. So if we take this D major chord here, and this 9/8 suspension, or this 9/8 trill over it, so very slowly, A, I, M, P, A, I, M, P, A, I, M, P, like that. Now I have to also make a decision beforehand about how many cycles of those. That was 4 cycles that I did there. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 that I'm going to have time for while still able to keep time. I choose the amount that I can get in and practice it, and so that makes it a little bit more reliable on stage. Another thing we should be striving for, by the way, while I'm on that subject with cross-string trills or right-hand trills, is I'd like to start a campaign of trying to decrescendo those cross-string trills and actually lengthen the first note. If we think about what a long trill like that is supposed to be, it's supposed to be an embellishment on a long note, and the affectation is that the higher note is the one that's the dissonant note, and it's coming to rest or resolve onto the note that's within the chord tone. In this case, E, which does not belong to the D major chord, resolving to the root of the chord D. So it's easy to kind of snap that trill at the end and actually. But what that does is that results in a crescendo at the end of the trill, which is the opposite thing of what should actually happen if you hear a string player play a trill. Of course, it's a little bit more natural. The physics of the bow actually allow the note to decrescendo, and they slow down the bow speed. Thereby, the note begins to hairpin downward. On the guitar, this is much harder to do because at the same time, another element of that is that the trill should actually accelerate. So oftentimes on the guitar, when you add more notes in a shorter space of time, it's hard not to make the sound louder. But I encourage all you guitarists out there to join me in my quest for decrescendoing, accelerating long note trills for the right hand. Even that last note can be very, very soft. Or even if it's just a shorter one like that. So you notice that I even put a rest stroke on the higher note with A sometimes. That also contributes to that aural illusion of the trill getting softer by putting a heavier note on the first note, putting a rest stroke. There we go. That's when the courant of the first note suite. Okay. And also, another thing I wanted to talk about is that you may notice in the Sarabande and in the Allemand, I also play left-hand trills too. When I was first implementing right-hand trills into my pieces in live performance, I really tried very hard to make it so that the trills are always cross-string trills or right-hand trills. I think I've probably loosened that up a little bit over the years. I actually like the mixture, again, just the same way I like the mixture of melodic ornamentation versus trills. I like the mixture of left-hand versus right-hand ornamentation. And another advantage to left-hand trilling is that, like the bow, and also like a breath and a wind instrument, the decrescendoing of the trill is actually more natural for the hand because you play the note first, and naturally the string energy, the sound energy of the string is dissipated. And So it's actually a much more natural thing to decrescendo it. So I like the sound of that too. It also has more of a kind of a lutey sound to it. So one last example, the Allemande 996, and this is an example that when you don't have a lot of space or time, if you feel like you're learning a piece and Bach has filled up all that space with notes and consecutive, more of a regular subdivision in the rhythm, such as the Allemande of 996, you can also use articulation as a means of varying a Baroque dance movement repeat as you play it the second time through. There's some pieces where Bach writes the music in a pretty regular subdivision of the pulse, such as the Allemande 996. So where you have while those notes belong to several different voices, at the same time there's really not a lot of opportunity unless you want to do. That's another one. That where you kind of fill in with much faster rhythms. But if that's uncomfortable, also investigate or use the idea of articulation itself, like actually changing the articulation or highlighting something in the polyphony as a means of counterpoint. So using that same piece, I'll go to the end of it, and there's a really nice thing starting in measure 13. There's a really nice thing in the polyphony. So you get this little imitation here in two different voices. And of course, as typical with Bach, it happens a third time. So that three measure pattern right there, the first time you play it through, if you like to, again, just keeping within the more gentle nature of this Allemande, the more legato and flowing sound of it, the first time. Then, the second time around, I actually like to highlight this polyphony for the listener, especially since they've already heard it the first time through. Now I like to just put a short note on the first note of the two-note grouping. So that just gives the listener something a little bit crunchier to digest there with that. And in some cases, I believe it can really help the listener hear the polyphony a bit more clearly. So to summarize, feel free to, in my opinion, I think it's a good thing to vary your trills, not always make them vary your ornamentation, I should say, to not always feel like you have to make them trills and not always feel like you have to make them melodic, and also feel like you don't always have to fill up the space all the time. And so have a nice mix of the two, and get in touch with the inner composer of you to be selective about which of those actually make a nice sounding repeat the second time through. And then also to summarize, just the right hand trill, the cross string trill approach, we should really be practicing and teaching that to lengthen or put a tenuto, so stretching the first couple of notes, adding a little bit of a accelerando, but at the same time decrescendoing that trill. And then third, use articulation. Articulation is another tool for helping to vary something the second time through. I hope this information is helpful and you get some ideas from it, and happy ornamenting.